Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. July 30th, 2022 marks the centennial of the birth of Miron Białoszewski, a unique figure in 20th century Polish literature. He was a poet inspired by the avant-gardism of the interwar period. He was the author of short prose works that revealed the poetry of everyday life and ordinary objects. And he is best known for his radical account of the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 from an unromanticized civilian perspective, the perspective of non-combatants whose lives and families are destroyed when cities are bombed, as Warsaw was during the Second World War, and as we have seen recently in cities like Mariupol in Ukraine. Białoszewski was a Varsovian through and through, so he does not write about the eastern borderlands or Ukraine, and his account of the war addresses the fact that Ukrainians and Poles were on opposite sides in World War II. But the current Polish outpouring of support for Ukraine offers some hope that ethnic conflict does not have to last forever, and we can look to Białoszewski's memoir of the Warsaw Uprising as an essential artistic statement about warfare in modern times. Białoszewski was unquestionably a victim of communism, who was unable to publish during what should have been his most productive years. He worked as a journalist for a bit after the war, but his unwillingness to conform to the dictates of socialist realism made him unemployable until the thaw of 1956, 3 years after the death of Stalin. He was also a relatively openly gay man for his era in People's Poland, which made him something of an outcast. His later short prose pieces and his posthumous work, A Memoir, spelled with 3 A's at the beginning, offer glimpses of what gay life was like in Poland under communism, but they require the reader to meet Białoszewski halfway by reading attentively and recognizing when Białoszewski is writing between the lines. Before we meet today's guest, I'd like to thank everyone who has been following along with Encounters with Polish Literature. If you like what you hear on the program, click the thumbs up down below. Ring the bell to get notifications about new episodes. Follow the playlist of all of our episodes in the description of the program. Leave a comment if you can, and please click the subscribe button to show the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, that you are interested and would like to hear more about Polish literature, its past and present, here on Encounters with Polish Literature. Also, be sure to hang on and watch the credits at the end for some recommendations about where you can donate to support humanitarian aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war. Our guest, Joanna Niżyńska, is an associate professor of Polish literature and culture in the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures at Indiana University, where she also served as director of the Polish Studies Center from 2015 to 2020. She approaches her field from a comparative perspective and pursues research that crosses disciplinary and national borders. Her longstanding interests in intersections between trauma, memory, and the everyday are reflected in her monograph, The Kingdom of Insignificance, Miron Białoszewski and the Quotidian, the Traumatic, and the Queer, published by Northwestern University Press in 2013. And she is a co-editor of Germany, Poland, and Postmemorial Relations, In Search of a Livable Past, from Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. And if you saw the first episode of Encounters with Polish Literature right here, you will recall that she is a co-editor of Being Poland, a new history of Polish literature and culture since 1918, an 800-page interdisciplinary volume with 60 contributions from a team of international scholars written with an English-speaking audience in mind. Her new book project investigates contemporary Poland's cultural memory from the perspective of long-lasting imprints of communist politics of memory, particularly as pertaining to the Polish-Jewish past. Welcome back to the program, Joanna. It's great to have you here again.
It's great to be here again. Thank you, David, for your kind invitation.
The first episode of Encounters with Polish Literature, I just checked, has 1,945 views, making it one of our most popular episodes. I think a lot of people will, they look at later episodes of the show and then they want to, go back to the beginning and see how it develops. So I think that's really getting a lot of attention for you and for Tamara Trojanowska from the University of Toronto and for Przemysław Kapliński, the authors of Being Poland, A New History of tell me the title exactly.
Being Poland, A New History of Polish Literature and Culture since 1918.
Right. So let's talk about our subject for today, Miron Białoszewski. So why don't we start by, tell our audience, who was Miron Białoszewski? When was he born? Tell us a little about his family and about his life.
Miron Białoszewski is one of the most fascinating writers of the post-war Polish literature, and very often he is considered as the most unique writer and labeled with such terms as osobny, separate, prywatny, private. Truly a unique case and a writer that became, in a sense, a cult writer for generations of readers and critics. One of the most influential voice, I have no doubts about it, for the contemporary literature. I think that contemporary literature, contemporary young writers really like to use Białoszewski's diction. Białoszewski was born in 1922. And died in 1983. He spent his entire life in Warsaw, called himself Bard Marszałkowski, Bard of Marszałkowska Street. Truly came from old Warsavian family. Born into very modest family, proletarian family. He belongs to the generation that came of age in the beginning of World War II. He was in Warsaw during the Warsaw Uprising. He was in Warsaw during Stalinist times when he was not published until 1956, until after the thaw. He was in Warsaw during periods of so-called small stabilization, until the Solidarity, until the martial law, and he unfortunately never saw the post-1989 period and a new Poland, so to speak. So truly a writer who belongs to whose entire writing belongs to the period of Cold War.
But one thing that's interesting to me about Białoszewski is that, especially in his early poetry, he seems like a poet of the interwar avant-garde period, or very much influenced by the avant-garde period. But he isn't published until 1956, after Stalinism, during the thaw in Eastern Europe. And I'm wondering, was he writing? Do we know if he was writing all that time, for the desk drawer?
We know that he was writing all this time. And there is this beautiful account, and there's a wonderful book called Miron, Wspomnienia o poecie. Basically, a book with his friends talking about their experiences with Miron Białoszewski. And there's this wonderful account. I don't remember who was the friend, but Miron, who is already in his 30s, talks to his friend and he says, I know that I have a real poetic talent and I know they will not publish a single poem of mine. And I always think about this moment, because we think about these writers when we know what happened next. When we know, yes, you will be published in 1956 and you will have a great career and you will be so important for everybody else writing in Poland, but he doesn't know it at the time, right? It's this kind of depth of despair. They will never publish a single poem of mine. So yes, he was writing throughout Stalinist period. He was basically kicked out of several jobs. It has a lot to do with homosexuality, not only with his decision not to follow the precepts of social realism. And we know that he lived in an extreme poverty. He was staying in bed all day long, using psychedryna. I don't remember what's the English translation for this stimulant. To keep himself awake, and he wrote one of his most famous poems from his early period, because his poetry was really evolving from what you call the modernist tradition, avant-garde tradition, to a much more idiosyncratic mode of very colloquial, very, very oral poetry that he practices later on in life.
It's interesting that, I mean, it's almost as if he's a little out of place, writing in this older style, and yet the language of the everyday is very much the language of post-war poetry. It's Różewicz, it's really all the the major post-war poets writing in this anti-heroic mode.
Yes, writing in an anti-heroic mode, but writing is often in anti-heroic mode about big themes, so to speak. And Białoszewski really is trying to escape. Well, it's not even that he's trying to escape. It seems like he is not interested in like letting the reader know that there is historiosophy in his writing. Of course, there is. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of politics, but it never comes across as a kind of discursive theme. You really need to start contextualizing, you need to start decoding, you need to really know his diction to know when he writes about straightforwardly political situations, which he encountered as a uncloseted and gay writer. So the diction, I think that there's a difference between his diction and Różewicz and other poets who use low register, right? They don't want to go into the kind of elevated Miłoszian poetics. There's a tremendous difference. But even if we assume, yes, that other writers were also using colloquial language, just the way he kind of draws his territory in terms of themes, subjects, what interests him, this attention to the everyday, to the insignificant, to the ordinary, to things that he overhears on the street, things that he sees on the bus. He is really the Bart of Marszałkowska Street for a reason.
Why don't we look at some of the poems? I was thinking maybe we'd start with perhaps his most translated poem. I've realized that I think I found it in 3 translations, which in the most well-known version that appears in The Revolution of Things, this is an extremely hard to find book. We're very lucky to have it in our university library here. And I will say that I am the first person to check it out.
I actually own this book. I don't know, I bought it in some old bookstore, but yes, it's out of print, and for decades, this is practically the only anthology, the only selection of Białoszewski's poetry that you could get in libraries only, but you could access, and it's anthology of his early poems. So it's not really representative of his entire oeuvre.
Yeah, it's translated by Andrzej Busza and Bogdan Tchaikovsky. It was published by the Charioteer Press in 1974, and it says inside the book that it was published in 400 copies. So, for all that time, this was it. There were some anthologies and journals that had special, selections from Białoszewski, but some where they were planned, but the rights were in doubt, so they never appeared. And maybe that explains why Białoszewski, such a unique poet in Polish, hasn't made as much of an impression in what Bożena Shallcross has called the transatlantic canon, the canon of Polish literature as it appears in English, as opposed to what it is in Polish.
I think that transatlantic canon, it's a wonderful expression, as you mentioned, by Bożena Shallcross, a scholar from University of Chicago, a wonderful scholar in Polish studies. It's a great expression, but I think that transatlantic canon is not that different from what I would call kind of a blueprints of Polish canon, right? A la national tradition. Because what is transatlantic canon? Transatlantic canon, maybe it's changing recently, especially with Olga Tokarczuk and the wonderful group of translators who are working on most contemporary Polish literature that certainly does not fit easily into this national tradition. But But the transatlantic canon is that which circulates in North America as representative of Polish literature. So what is translated, what is taught on various campuses, what is associated with the Central Eastern European region and history. And, we need to remember that Cold War has dramatically affected the circulation and reception of Polish literature. So I think that the legacy of Polish literature was seen by American readers as part of the larger formation of literature under oppression. So this canon for decades was dominated by the category, let's call it ethics and poetics, right? From a wonderful phrase from Stanisław Barańczak. Though, of course, there were plenty of examples of writers who would not fit that label. But, foreign readers likes to see the region in a particular way. And I think that Polish literature was seen as predominantly historical, historiosophic, political sensu stricto, bardic, traumatic, martyrological. And I could, list several famous names that would fit that label. Of course, Miłosz was a towering figure for American readers and how they saw Polish literature. So this idea of Milan Kundera's famous idea of Eastern Europe as the kidnapped conscience of the West, I think it really affected the reception of Polish literature in the US for sure. So here we have a completely different writer who doesn't fit that canon, right? Of course, he was also political. Of course, he was also ironic. Of course, he was also historical, but in a way that did not fit the code, did not fit the mold that readers were used to. Especially abroad. I'm very excited because there is a new anthology of Białoszewski's prose and poetry coming up. And it's an anthology that is a collaborative work of three renowned translators, thinking about Alyssa Wallis, who translated Białoszewski's prose, Claire Kavanagh, who translated poetry, and Claire Kavanagh teamed up with Michał Rysinek to do so, to work on Białoszewski's extremely difficult and idiosyncratic poetry. So this book is already under contract with New York Review Books Classics series. It's the same series in which a revised translation of A Memoir of the Warsaw Uprising was published, I think 7 years ago.
2015.
I think that they have a wonderful editor there who really recognized Białoszewski's greatness and wants to popularize him in the US.
That would be Edwin Frank. So let's look at this poem that before we digressed, that we were starting to, called "Oh, should they take away my stove, my inexhaustible ode to joy." It depends so much on his linguistic play in Polish. Would you like to read it in Polish and then I'll read it in English, in Bush's translation? Bushan Tchaikovsky?
Ach, gdyby nawet piec zabrali, moja niewyczerpana oda do radości. Mam piec podobny do bramy triumfalnej. Zabierają mi piec podobny do bramy triumfalnej. Oddajcie mi piec podobny do bramy triumfalnej. Zabrali. Została po nim tylko szara, naga jama. Szara, naga jama. I to mi wystarczy. Shara naga yama, shara naga yama, shara naga yama, shara naga yama.
Oh, should they take away my stove, my inexhaustible ode to joy. I have a stove like a triumphal arch. They're taking away my stove like a triumphal arch. Give me back my stove like a triumphal arch. They took it away. All that's left is a gray, gaping hole. A gray, gaping hole. And that's enough for me. Gray, gaping hole, gray, gaping hole, gray, gaping hole, gray, gaping hole.
How you can make Japanese out of the stove. Not there anymore.
Shara Nagayama, because yama is actually a word in Japanese as well as in Polish, although they mean opposite things. a yama in Polish is a cave or a hole, and a yama in Japanese is a mountain.
So that, but to the Polish ear, that this is Japanese, Sharanagayama, Sharanagayama. That sounds very Japanese. I don't know how does it sound for American ear, Sharanagayama. Does it sound Japanese?
I suppose it could pass. I don't know. I mean, I live in a place with a lot of Japanese culture, so if somebody said that in the middle of a Japanese sentence and I don't understand Japanese, I might assume that they were speaking Japanese and not quoting something from Polish. So it's possible. This was part of the section of Białoszewski's first collection called Groteski. So is it some kind of parody, do you think? Or what is a grotesque for Białoszewski?
Well, it's certainly a funny poem. I would not take Białoszewski's genre according to our classic definitions of what grotesque is. Why don't we just maybe look at the poem and see what he does in it? And I think it will show us more what he does with the reality rather than try to bite him from the perspective of genres, which is a very complex matter.
Okay.
Maybe that's interesting for our viewers. I just wanted to add that this first collection, Revolution of Things, was initially titled Słowa dodawane do rzeczy, words added to things in a literal translation, and then it was changed to what was supposed to sound better, the Revolution of Things. But I think the original title really emphasizes the linguistic nature of Białoszewski's quotidian. So there is something very, I think, symptomatic in that original title. So first of all, I wanted to say that the stove really existed. We have these beautiful photographs of this old stove. In Polish, it's piec kaflowy. I'm not sure if stove really renders the specificity of the object very well. It's one of those beautiful old tiled stoves that were kind of art object in themselves, which of course Białoszewski compares to the triumphant arch, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So there are different ways to read Białoszewski. Claire Kavanagh reads him as a hyper-realist, and she always says, like, he is about real situations, and I just have to find a way to imagine them. I think that he's not always about real situations that you have to kind of find a way to imagine. Sometimes he's just about the real situation with your tongue and how it plays with words, but often he is actually a hyper-realist. And I think in this case, well, there's a stove that was in his room that was taken away, was basically dismantled. Those beautiful tiles were dismantled and moved. And he was left with Miron Białoszewski, but also the speaker, was left with that gray gaping hole. So the whole poem is about transforming the laws, or transforming absence into this Japanese word, into this linguistic gain. So something is taken away from him, but he makes this loss into something else, something that is enough for him, right? I to mi wystarczy, says the speaker, and makes this wonderful, exotically sounding word. But I think that, when you're asking about grotesque, you asked in the beginning, and the grotesque is always about juxtaposition of different incongruous elements. And here we have this stove juxtaposed with the ode, right? This is ode to what's the title?
Ode to joy.
Ode to joy. Ode to niewyczerpana.
Oda do radości.
Yes, an exhaustible ode to joy, right? And the ode, we're thinking about ode, or immediately thinking about Beethoven, but we also think about the tradition of literary ode as tradition of elevated subjects. And here, what we have here is this very quotidian, ordinary object that is elevated, is sacralized, and becomes ultimately something else, becomes something exotic.
So, there are stoves in literary history, right? I mean, there's Descartes' famous stove that in the Discourse on Method, where he, it's often mistranslated that I closed myself into a stove, but he was in a room that was heated by exactly such a stove. And Alexander Watt had an early poem, an experiment in automatic writing, where he says, which he calls, I from one side and from the other side of my pig iron stove. So there are stoves there in the background of Białoszewski. Whether he's thinking about them, I'm not sure. And there's also, I think,
attitude there. That's what counts, right? There's a tongue-in-cheek attitude, this exuberance about playing with the old, with a taken away stove, right? Like, so I think that even if you don't know anything about traditional stoves in world literature, you still have the same fun, even though, of course, when you know it you can unfold it from a even richer perspective.
And the tiled stove is like a vestige of an earlier time, and there's a lot of gray in the revolutionary of things, right? The gray eminences, and so forth. That's it's something that he returns to. That Miłosz in the history refers to this early poetry as like language beaten into a pulp. That's
well, he also called his early poetry, no, not a little bit later poetry, from było, right? Like it's a prasłowiańskie kumkanie. I don't even know how to translate it, but he was very, very negative until he was very positive, right? It took him 30 years to really change his song about Białoszewski, but he eventually became his great fan. He's a great admirer of him.
I think language beaten into a pulp isn't entirely negative. It's something I think that he admires. I think he admires Białoszewski's boldness and ability to do that, and that's he says he admires that also in the memoir of the Warsaw Uprising. That was the reality of the uprising, was language beaten into a pulp.
Well, actually, Miłosz has some fantastic expressions, phrases about Białoszewski, and you can really see his evolution again from this kumkanie, the frog sound, right?
Yeah.
To the pulp and later on to something else. But that's like, it deserves its own story. How Miłosz, who was so cherished by his readers. I think how Miłosz was coming to terms with a tradition that was very, very foreign to him, like as a writer, right? And how Miłosz, whom we think about as this amazing speaker of Polish, amazing writer of Polish, how he felt had some certain inferiority complex in relation to Białoszewski, thinking that his Lithuanian Polish was provincial, while Białoszewski is really rooted in the central Warsavian, Polish, and it's a better kind, in a sense that it's closer to how people speak, and it's closer to the changes in language. While Miłosz's classic diction, he considered it in certain contexts, when you look at him, how he talks about Białoszewski as a certain deficiency almost, that he can't do what Białoszewski is able to do. He can't do it, and he realizes it, and at a certain point, he really starts to admire it.
Right. So let's think a little more about Warsaw and the memoir of the Warsaw Uprising, which is another, one of the few works that you can currently, until the new translations come out, read in English, just to sort of set, the frame of reference. There's people often confuse the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 with the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. So this is about the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. that it was translated originally, I think, in 1977 by Madeline Levine, and then a new edition, as you say, of the Polish version, an uncensored version, came out in 2014, and then only in 2015 do we have this new translation, which is it contains the some missing passages, and some parts are seem quite reworked, and some parts less so. But maybe we should look at it and see what he's doing and where his these poetic influences appear in this work of that we might call prose, and maybe not. I'm not sure. Let's look at this passage at the opening where he kind of frames the whole work, and sometimes this kind of passage is called an autobiographical pact in the theory of memoir and autobiography. I shall be frank, recollecting my distant self in small facts, perhaps excessively precise, but there will be only the truth. I am 45 years old now. 23 years have gone by. I am lying here on my couch, safe and sound, free, in good health and spirits. It is October night, 1967.
Yeah, I love this opening because it already sets up this work as belated. So it's over 20 years after the event, 23 years to be exact, but 20 years since he, when he writes it. He wrote it in the second half of the 60s. And we have immediately these two narrators, one that is lying on the couch in good spirits and in good health. And it's nighttime, it's October 1967. And there's this other one that he's going to recollect, bring back. And that's this young him, his young self, right? Białoszewski was only 22 during the uprising. And what I love about it is that throughout the memoir, you have this amazing interplay between those two narrators that Białoszewski is able to play with different types of memory. So there's this young self that will not know whether he would survive, and that young self doesn't experience the reality fully because he's so overwhelmed by reality that he's not even able fully to register it, which is, of course, typical for people who are participating in radical extreme events, right? Typical for actually traumatic memory, if we were to use clinical expressions. And then there is this other older self, the experienced narrator, who already survived. He knows that he survived because he's there. And he fully re-experiences the uprising in the narration, right? He is already traumatized, and bringing it back requires the performance of re-traumatization. So I think it's wonderful. It's wonderful to have these two narrators, because what it keeps for us, what is kind of what it creates for us, us as Białoszewski's reader, is this simultaneous ordinariness of the extreme reality. It's something that we can express in the phrase "it was common then," something that would feel like impossible was common then, and then incomprehensibility of it. So on the one hand, it's ordinary and that's how it is, and then it's incomprehensible, and it's because he's two people at once in the memoir.
It's he's often talking about how he can't reconstruct the timeline. He can't reconstruct the dates. He's confused about what happened when, how everything has kind of become mixed together in his memory. And it sort of points up, the fact that's probably true of a lot of memoir, really, is that they're often like different timelines, and that they're both real is I think what's important about them. That, there's this, what we, might call the phenomenological, timeline, the timeline that really exists in his head, and that is how he constructs ideas and how he associates places and names and so forth. And then, well, if you looked at, and you tried to, reconstruct it from the newspaper or something like that, and historical sources, you might find something different, but it wouldn't necessarily invalidate what exists in his mind and the way that he's constructed that, I think.
He's really striving for precision, but it's very interesting how he uses sources, right? He very often goes to other people to confirm it. I don't know actually to what extent he would go to historical sources to cross-reference his dates, but he certainly did something that we could call, a work of an oral historian who gathers sources. So there are like many sources in this book, and those sources are his friends, his acquaintances. The sources are also newspapers that he remembers, radio broadcasting, and so it's not just existing in the vacuum of information. No, I mean he refers to what we would call media. But I think that his way of confirming the event, confirming whether he's precise on the dates, and the dates are important for him because, as you said, like it's his kupa konstrukcyjna, right, pile of constructions. It allows him to somehow structure this really immense reality, immense in its overwhelming factuality, right, sensorily overwhelming, factually overwhelming. So he needs these dates as a way to structure the narrative.
The sensory is very much present in the way. I mean, as I was rereading it this time, it was like it's like the words are kind of, the sentences are very fragmented. They're like machine gun fire, right? I mean, it's like one phrase, another phrase. Maybe we can find a good one. Like I mean, just and they're alternating. They're alternating with these kind of metatextual kinds of reflections on am I getting it right? And then all of a sudden we're in the middle of like a bombing or something like that. And I was thinking, as we're I mean, this is a civilian account of the Warsaw Uprising, and that's what makes it kind of anti-heroic, to use the expression we were using before. You can't write this kind of thing during wartime, right? I mean, there's no time to sit down. The genres of wartime are like poetry and lyric and things like that. But 20 some years later, it's possible. And if we're thinking about, the situation we're watching right now in Ukraine, right, where civilians are being bombed, and we want to know what that might feel like. I mean, this is one of the kinds of sources that tells you, what it's like to be in a basement, and, counting the time between when the bomb hits the building and when it's going to explode, or you're going to realize that it's a dud and it's not going to explode. That's very much the, what you call the phenomenological style.
Yeah, but the very fact that we value, not only that we want to know, but we also value accounts, literary accounts of such experiences, is due to the fact that writers like Białoszewski really validated civilian experience. And it's kind of, maybe for us, it seems like obvious that civilian experience should be validated and acknowledged and recorded. But actually, it wasn't obvious. And in 1970, when Białoszewski published the book, I mean, he really, in order to understand what kind of scandal this book caused, you really need to understand how the elevated status of the event itself in cultural memory. And this event that was represented as a heroic deed of young soldiers, beautiful soldiers sacrificing their lives at the altar of motherland. And that, of course, is connected very much to the Polish tradition. Let them watch us when we are dying, to quote Słowacki, made the event really untouchable, this elevated status. So when Białoszewski is not writing about military deeds, not writing about anything heroic, writing about mothers in the basement with chamber pots for their children and trying to cook on 2 bricks. When he's writing about problems with physiological needs and where to go during the bombardment, that may be already normal for us in 2022, but in 1970 it caused a real scandal. And I like always to refer to Wojciech Żukrowski's review of the book because it really tells you kind of the radicality of the memoir. So Wojciech Żukrowski himself, a writer, called Białoszewski's narrator overgrown baby, wyrośnięty niemowlak. He said that this is someone who is reduced to his digestive functions, someone with amputated memory. So that was really the very first wave of reception. Of course, immediately there were people who recognized that this is truly a masterpiece. And Maria Janion was the first with her amazing essay Wojna I Forma, War and Form, where she really recognized that the kind of testimony, that the value of the testimony, of the civilian testimony and what it does to our understanding of the war, and brilliantly criticized the romantic paradigm that is so deeply rooted in Polish culture. But I think it's important to go back to that first initial reaction. That was a scandal. That was a scandalous work.
And let me just read a passage from what was scandalous. I mean, this is one of those accounts. This is on page 72 of the new edition. All of a sudden, bombers. Already, they're hovering over the rooftops, raining down bombs. Now they're gone. Now they're back, farther away, closer. Now they're flying into Baroque Street. We are too. They're flying blindly. We are too. We is I. And someone else, like me, we, 2 of us, here only, neither here nor there, because now they're here. We run. That's trying to capture that experience in the moment, and represent something that must be unrepresentable in some way, in something that's almost like poetry, that maybe is poetry. Maybe that's what it is. I mean, maybe that's all that
says, right? That the poetry, that the reality was poetic because it was multiplying in your head, right? So this sensory overload, he really labels as poetic. But in this passage, what I love in this passage, this phenomenology of motion, right? Mm-hmm. We is I, or I is we, I don't remember. But that's very, it's not just something that many critics and Białoszewski himself emphasized, that people were tending, they had this tendency during the uprising to stay in a herd, right? Zostać w stadzie. Be with others, even if others who are just in your herd for 5 minutes, but not to be alone. But just this kind of amazing, so deeply philosophical understanding what is I vis-a-vis we. And I remember there's this one passage, I wish I had it prepared, but it's just kind of, you triggered my chain of associations. It was this wonderful passage when after the bombardment, he looks at the people and he says, he first say us, meaning did it hit us, right? Us. And then he says, no, because we are still here. There was no other proof. And it's, to me, is such a deeply philosophical thing to say, like, us, like, do I still exist? Am I still alive? No, because we are still here. There's no other proof, right? Like, it's coming back into your body and understanding that, yes, I am present. I'm still alive. That must be a proof, right? That I am.
Maybe we're back with a Descartes stove, right? I mean, it's like, yes, I am. I'm still here, right?
Yeah, but it's I am. It's not the I am of a cogito. It's I am of I'm coming back into my body, right? Like I'm coming back to the body from this amazing moment of fear. And there's another passage, if you remember, when I thought that it was just such a wonderful description. It's a passage that we were thinking about talking when he talks about something crumbling.
That's one of the places where one of the things that she changed. It's and I think it's more precise. I don't have the Polish. It's at the end of it. Osypiany, right? I mean, there's sifting,
I can
right?
tell you. Tylko coś szumiało, osypywało się, jeszcze osypało się, osypało. And in the old translation, it's crumbling.
It's crumbling, but the new one, it's sifting.
Oh, I like that. Sifting.
I think like that's
sifting flour, right? Like sifting flour.
It's a good choice.
And how did she do the aspect? Can you?
Oh, so again, the vibrations began, a noisy moving about, more and more. Sven squeezed my knee. I pressed my eyes into my face and hid my head in my collar. Is that it already? Already? Yes, too bad. Only will it strike from the head to the feet? Will it knock you flat? If only it could be quick. 2 ceilings crashed down together from the second floor to the ground floor. So now it was our turn. Sven pressed his head against my knee. Sven's mother stood there without changing her position. It was very quiet. There was absolute silence. Only something was rumbling, sifting down, still sifting.
I get shivers when I read this passage. This amazing representation of utter fear, and what goes through someone's head, right? What goes through the narrator's head. May it be quick. Yeah. It's wonderful. I was asking about aspect, right? Because Polish allows you to say like it's not just sifting, but it allows you to say like it has sifted, right? Osypywało się, jeszcze osypało się. So you have this, just one letter changing the temporal aspect. Osypało, right? Completing this action. I was just thinking when I was reading this passage, and now it just came to my mind something completely different. But this is how associations work in literature. When you're a reader. I don't know if you remember the landing of the plane on the Hudson River.
Yeah.
I
was in New York.
It was a big deal, right? This plane that was that lost both engines and the pilot, very skilled and skillful pilot, landed on the Hudson River. Everybody survived. Nobody was on the river. Nobody was harmed. In the plane, nobody was harmed. But I then read about what was going on the plane, and I found it very moving that there was a complete silence, and there was just this pilot saying, "Prepare for the impact," but it was complete silence. And here in that moment when they are waiting for the ceiling to crash on them, there's complete silence. This kind of stillness. And only we can have this racing thoughts. It's brilliant. It's brilliant writing. It's horrifying experience, but expressed in such a brilliant writing.
It's its own time space, the time space of anticipation like this, right? I mean,
yes.
chronotope, as we say.
Yes, chronotope. Yes, absolutely, chronotope. Yeah. Full of chronotopes, memoirs.
Right. Yeah. Let's look at that other passage we were thinking about, discussing about. This is another one that's significantly different from the translation, which is a moment of meta memoir, where she in the older version she had all of this is like one prolonged hallucination, but she changes that to illusion, which is I think closer to.
You will need to read it because in front of me I have an old translation.
Here he is reflecting, kind of in the modern day on these earlier moments, and he says, "All of this is like one prolonged illusion, an awfully trite tale. But only this suits me. For what was felt then, because you didn't have to be a poet to have things multiplying in your head. If I write very little about my impressions, and everything in ordinary language, as if nothing happened, or if I hardly ever look inside myself or seemingly from the outside. It is only because it can't be done any other way. After all, that is how we experience things. And generally speaking, that is the only device, not an artificially constructed one, but the only completely natural device to convey all of this. For 20 years, I could not write about this. Although I wanted to very much, I talked about the uprising to so many people, all sorts of people, so many times, and all along, I was thinking that I must describe the uprising, somehow or other describe it. And I didn't even know that those 20 years of talking, I have been talking about it for 20 years because it is the greatest experience of my life, a closed experience. Precisely this talking is the only device suited to describing the uprising.
Talking is a good way to write. And when he talks to people for 20 years, he cannot write because we have his, we know from his writing that he wanted to write about the uprising and he couldn't, and he kept talking, It's a wonderful passage that in a sense is self-explanatory. He couldn't write. And then this kind of realization that actually he's closest when he keeps talking, right? So he needs to reenact talking. It's hyper orality because nobody talks like that the way he writes. He kind of hyperbolizes qualities of the oral expression, but in my book I talk about it as a kind of a function of memory, right? Like how memory really works, and at what point memory can be put into a form, right? But I think it's
your book, which we should show, The Kingdom of Insignificance, Miron Białoszewski, and the quotidian, the queer, and the traumatic. So there's not very much criticism about Białoszewski in book form in English, is there? Is this one of the only?
There's nothing in North America in a book form. So this book is the only one, and there is one book in Europe by Artur Płaczkiewicz, published by Peter Lang, on poetry. That's right. On poetry. So there are just two books in English, and hopefully there will be more once we have translations, because translations trigger also academic work. Once you can teach, right? Once you can teach, of course, that really helps with finding a publisher for an academic monograph on an unknown writer.
It's hard to publish a book about a writer who hasn't been translated into the language that the book will be written in, right? I mean, so let's think a little bit about the well-known but long ignored topic in Białoszewski, which is the queer dimension. Which you write about in your book. I mean, certainly you mentioned that that probably had something to do with his being excluded from writer circles. Although there were other gay writers who were able to survive. I think Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz would be the prime example of somebody who managed to. But of course, he was married, so he could pass. But Białoszewski, wasn't willing to make that compromise.
Białoszewski was not interested in passing, but that, of course, also reduced his options. I don't think he would be able to be public intellectual as many other Polish writers were at the time, like Iwaszkiewicz. If he were uncloseted homosexual, but I like to call it pedal to the metal. In some sense, I think that he was aware who he is very early on, and decided, in a sense, to radicalize his otherness and just live according create a niche for himself and live according to his own rules. But of course, there was a price for it. And that price was, again, in the Stalinist years, not being published. And later on also, again, being always a little bit on the margins, while at the same time having very loyal critics and writers, and being very, very much engaged with his audience. And he cared for his audience. No writer wants to write for himself or herself, right? So it's not like he didn't care for his audience. He cared very much, but he created his own type of audience in a sense. He was critics writer. All his wonderful critics are scholars from the Polish Academy of Sciences. So he was very, very cherished by critics. But he was a niche writer. He was recognized, but somehow always in his own niche. So yes, lived his life as much as he could with his partners. Leszek Soliński, who had the rights that he didn't want to release for a long time, was his longtime partner. Suffered from homophobia, had slurs written on his doors, was interrogated by militia, policia, right? Militia rather. And he writes about it in his prose. When you know how to read it, you really see it. When you don't know how to read it, you just find it a little bit strange. You don't know maybe what's going on, but that's all right, right? And you move forward. So he works for the knowing and unknowing reader. But once you know what he struggles with, once you understand his way of coding things, I call it naturalizing subversion, right? Like he's very subversive, but he gives it to you in such a natural form, as such a part of his everyday that he represents very consistently in his so-called small narrations, these small prose forms that you don't notice.
You talk about in the book about gender ambiguity that he uses in Polish. Of course, we always have to specify the gender of everything, but he manages to find a way to avoid that where possible. That he has a certain kind of doubleness in his speech, which we can think about. This was on one level, like kind of the norm for the 1970s, right? Is this speaking on two different levels, writing between the lines, but yet he has another thing to write about other than, he's not just, criticizing the communist system. I mean, he's writing about homosexuality, which is a difficult topic for his audience. Do you want to point out a few of these passages that you've highlighted in the book?
Well, you mentioned this unspecificity, right? So why don't we look at the passage with Włodek and the railway station?
Why don't you read it, since this is your translation, isn't it?
Yeah, this is my translation. So I'm not a translator. So this is just to be functional. Włodek told us regarding the recent troubles in that household that people still find him attractive. The other day he was going home, 1 o'clock at night. He stopped by the Gdańsk railway station to get some cigarettes. Someone off to the side started flirting with him. Bit by bit, they got to talking. But since this person's train was leaving in an hour, so how could they go back to Bielany? They made a date for tonight because this person is coming by train at 22:47. And Włodek goes.
So we have the ambiguous person, this person, some person.
Yes, we have this person. We have this person, someone, right? We have this, like, what's going on? He's suddenly, Gdańsk railway station is, by the way, one of the several railway stations in Warsaw, not to confuse with Gdańsk, the city. But what is very interesting here is not just this unspecificity of the grammatically neutral person or someone, but the fact that if you were a faithful reader of Białoszewski, and he, in some sense, trained his readers in a series of his prose. Like you got used to, you know who Włodek is one of the people in the narrators who also is Miron, right? There's a Miron and there's a Miron. It's Miron Białoszewski and Miron the narrator, synleptic, subjectivity. So merging the narrator with the author. You know that Białoszewski, like with the specificity in the memoir, is all about specificity. In the memoir, he tells you, like, I want all these little facts, everything to be registered, because this is my way to really give testimony. But here we have a person and someone, and I think that, a reader who knows, who knows Białoszewski finds it strange, So in some sense, someone who doesn't know Białoszewski well will just like pass it. Okay, someone who knows who is that person who's flirting, right? But when you know that Białoszewski is very specific, that unspecificity, well, maybe it's like really like giving the reader a signal to notice it, and to say like, something is off here, so that's one of the ways to read it. Also, that he basically, unspecificity is not just to say without being noticed, but also unspecificity for a certain group of readers is actually asking them to notice, because he's such a specific writer. And when there is unspecificity, it really stands out, right? For people who really know his writing, but those who don't, that passes very easily. But I wanted to also direct your attention to this phrase. Włodek told us in the context of the recent troubles in that household, right? W związku z problemami ostatnich czasów tego domu, which is a very clumsy phrase, but it's, again, one of those also unspecific clauses, and that had something to do with interrogations by the militia, by denunciations that were sent against Białoszewski and his then partner, flatmate, right? So when you know what is behind this very unspecific phrase, I mean, you suddenly, a new context completely opens up for you. So this is what I think is very interesting about him. He didn't have to write it. All these recent troubles of this in that household. Why did he even write it to publish it, right? Like, so he is. So he's playing with various modes, and one of those modes is unspecificity, that is for people who know him quite specific, and people who don't know him can pass very easily as like one of those, well, something.
He's playing with the horizon of expectations, right?
Yes,
I mean, that
very much so. Yeah, I use in my book this expression, Zizek's expression, looking awry, right? Like if you look at something at the angle, you suddenly see different colors when you look at the texture of something, right? You see different colors, different ways things are, threads are entangled, right? If you look at the textile, but and I think that this is the way, in a sense, to think about Białoszewski. You look awry, you see different things when you look straightforward, naively. But naively, I don't mean it pejoratively. It's just simply without already knowing. But I also wanted to tell you, because you started something very important, I think, about this queer aspect. When we are talking about this transatlantic canon. We are talking about how to Americanize Białoszewski, how to sell him, how to promote him for the American audience. I think that this is such a fascinating, and completely unknown representation of the communist Poland. From the perspective, again, of this writer who has his audience, who has his critics, but who stands a little bit aside, and lives his life that his very well-known friend, Ludwig Hering, who's his friend and mentor, he called his life Maximally Successful Existence. This is also a title of a wonderful book by Anna Sobolewska, Białoszewski's critic and friend, about, Białoszewski's existential project, which was really this kind of fusion of life and writing, his life writing. And I think that, American audience should be really interested in this completely different view of what would be seen as, maybe in some aspects, as subculture, that would be seen as a different view of the city that he so amazingly maps out for us when we enter, gay bars and we have these encounters at the railway station, and what was happening. Also from the context of sexual minorities. So I think it's also one of the ways to reach the audience, to show that this is a very unknown and very fascinating, wonderful, worth knowing image representation of the Iron Curtain countries, right?
He comes to the United States in 1982 to receive the Niżyńska Prize, and he wanders into a porn theater in Times Square, which, if you want the American gay representation of those theaters, the key book is Samuel R. Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. But here he is coming from his Eastern European perspective, talking about wandering into these, and it's another thing where he's playing with the horizon of expectations. Maybe we should read it. Do you want to read it?
So this is porn shows, right, in Times Square in New York, from his book America, that describes his visit to the States to receive this award that you mentioned in 1982. Są i kina, i dla samych panów, z napisami na wierzchu Male. Tam też się wchodzi, siada. Też taśma się nieraz zrywa, ale się cierpliwie czeka. Co pewien czas ktoś wstaje i idzie za kulisy. Okazuje się, że to salon ulgi. Też jęki i dojeżdżania rakiet międzyplanetarnych wyjących. Trafiłem również do kina Male z rewią męską. Po każdym występie klaszcze się. I tak świetnie zeszedł mi wieczór.
So there's some little English-Polish wordplay there. So your translation, I'll read, is there are also cinemas for men only, labeled, and Joanna is pronouncing it male, or male, as we would read it in English. You enter, you sit, just like in other theaters. Here, too, the reel and the projector tear sometimes, and one waits patiently. From time to time, someone gets up and goes behind the curtain. This turns out to be the relief parlor. There's moaning here too, and the whining of interplanetary rockets coming into the home stretch. I also went to a male cinema with an all-male review. After every performance, people applaud. And so I spent a delightful evening.
We should probably mention to our viewers that we read it as Male because this is how Białoszewski would read it. And he liked to perform his writing he had this special gatherings for his friends when he would try new prose, right? So he would read it Male. He didn't know English. And this is what it looks like.
So what's he saying to his audience?
That's an interesting question. I think he's trying to come out. Mm-hmm. And of course, this amazing enjoyment, right? With these male shows, his exuberance, his delightful evenings in New York, which are like never, ever before he was so straightforward, right? And suddenly he's like a dog off the leash, right? New York, surrounded by but what was subculture for him in Warsaw was suddenly just alternative culture in New York.
There's this great moment, speaking of, trying to come out, where, he later, says, there's this wonderful interview that you quote. Maybe I'll just read it and then we can discuss it. And he's asked, how did it happen that you came out of the closet? Perhaps my Polish is not so good because I don't use much Polish anymore, but I hope you understand me. And he says, yes, perfectly. And I explained to him that I first got thrown out of my bed into the hospital and then into the sanatorium, and then I moved. That made it easier to travel to Budapest. And after the pleasures in Budapest, it was easier to travel somewhere else. So this is how I learned to travel. Even though it's still a big deal, just like with these dollars, I can't take myself so seriously with all of this. And it seems like he's totally diverted the question and answered it and not answered it at the same time.
Exactly. And of course, in terms of this particular passage, you read it very differently. I don't remember what was the original publication date for America. It was posthumously published.
Yes.
So he died in 1983, right? So a few years after his visit, people did not know the expression "wyjść z szafy," come out of the closet, right? So this would be, again, it's only horizon of expectations, but kind of like this larger cultural horizon. 10 years later, that would be that passage you would read completely differently, knowing exactly the idiom, which everybody knows now. But I wanted to go back for a second to that first passage, because I think it's that just as one of those similar, maybe structurally similar moments that we see with passage on Włodek and railway station. Because here we have a great specificity, right? That he went to that male show and to the other male show, and he describes to you, even though they are similar, he would still like tell you that there was another one. And I think that here he plays with the expectations of his readers, who expect specificity from him, because he is such a careful observer and witness to various forms of life. So when he would describe Warszawa or Garwolin, a small town, right, where his mother lived, he would use a very similar cognitive strategies. He would just tell you about it the way he tells you about these male porn shows. So it's like now he is putting completely new cultural material, but through the very similar techniques. And again, the reader will either take it or it's a tourist's curiosity. He's always a curious observer, right? So is he just curious as going there, or is there something personal, right? There is this double gaze there as well, right? So first you had double gaze with unspecificity, and here you have double gaze with specificity. But I personally think that he wanted to kind of make it very clear in America that he enjoys it personally, that it was some kind of frustrated coming out. And I'm calling it frustrated because maybe he actually became a victim of his own strategies that people would, maybe some readers would say like, oh, he's so specific, and because he likes to notice everything. I don't know. On
that note, let me ask you, what's your next project?
Well, I haven't been working on Białoszewski for a while, although I am one of the editors of Mirofor, which is an annual journal dedicated to studies of Miron Białoszewski, and this one will be dedicated to the memoir that celebrated its centenary a couple of years ago. So I'm one of the 3 editors. I edited with Adam Poprawa, who edited uncensored version of the memoir, and Piotr Sobolczyk, who is a great specialist in queer studies, and he wrote a lot about queerness in Białoszewski. So this is my kind of most immediate project that we are just finishing up. But I was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to Warsaw for a full academic year.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's not easy, so I'm very pleased. Where I will be working on my book on the cultural memory of March 1968 anti-Semitic campaign. I've been recently working with Polish Jewish topics. I'm very fascinated by this particular event and its cultural repercussions. So this is my next big project.
Well, thank you. It's been great to have you on the program again, and I hope we can do it again soon when maybe when your next book is ready.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for promoting Polish literature in such a delightful way.
just a moment. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications about new videos from the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Go to the Polish Cultural Institute's website, linked in the description below, to see a full schedule of upcoming episodes. And stay tuned for the credits for some recommendations about how you can support humanitarian aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. Our sponsor, the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is directed by Robert Szaniawski. Bartek Remisko, head of humanities and literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, suggested this series and is our executive producer. My fellow producer, Natalia Iudin, handles all the video editing, technical, and aesthetic aspects of this production. Claudia Ofłona-Draber, head of communications at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, keeps us all informed about upcoming episodes of Encounters with Polish Literature and other events organized by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. In the next episode, we'll be offering another discussion in our Ukrainian series as we meet Ostap Kin and John Hennessy, two prolific translators of the Ukrainian poet Serhii Zhadan, who is widely considered a candidate for the Nobel Prize in Literature. See you in a month.